We were talking last week, well, we had finished up our discussion of the teleological argument along with what's sometimes considered a argument for the existence of God, that is the aesthetic argument. Sometimes it's a standalone, but considered to be part of that. And when we talk about the aesthetic argument or the teleological argument, we're talking about the fact that the created world, the created universe in which we live exhibits design and exhibits order and it exhibits purpose. And so a very positive argument for the existence of the God of the Bible. And of course that is in opposite to the teaching of materialism and atheistic evolution, that things are actually getting better. Well, I mean, anybody with common sense can look around and see that's just not happening. The universe is actually running down, according to the second law of thermodynamics. And so we talked about that. So the response to that, many times from the atheists, they respond with what they believe to be their best argument from a philosophical perspective against the existence of the God of the Bible, and that is the existence of what we might call evil, pain, and suffering in the world in which we live. And of course, a lot of this is subjective. In other words, it is the atheist or the human individual, who is of course fallible, deciding what he believes the best environment would be. It's his own opinion, as if he's in a position to make that kind of decision. But nevertheless, it is an argument that we need to deal with, and we began talking about it last week. And we started out and we saw that, first of all, the argument used to be, well, there's, quote, evil, this term evil in the world. Well, it doesn't take long to figure out that if you're an atheist, a materialist, and you don't believe that there is a higher moral power, that there's anything beyond the physical realm in which you find yourself, then that's a non-starter, because you have nothing on which to base the concept of evil. I mean, there couldn't be any such thing as evil if there is no God, and that's your position, there is no God. So that doesn't go very far, because you can't even talk about evil. Evil is only defined in the sense that it is the opposite of what? Good. And if everything is material, then there is no such thing as good and evil. It's just survival of the fittest. It's dog eat dog, as an animal lives. So the argument then progresses to the point of, well, it's not evil, but it is the problem of, quote, suffering. The fact that there is suffering in the world then indicates that there couldn't be the God that you worship. And remember now, the argument goes like this. The God of the Bible is supposedly omnibenevolent. That is, He is all good. But He is also omnipotent, meaning He is all powerful. And their argument says, well, if He's really all powerful, and there's, quote, evil or suffering in the world, then He's not all good, because He wouldn't want that. Well, first of all, that's not true. And we'll talk about that today. But number two, if He's all good and there's evil and suffering in the world, then He's not all powerful, because He can't get rid of it. That's supposedly their argument. So, first of all, they can't even talk about evil. Number two, they then say, well, there's suffering in the world. But it doesn't get long into that argument when they have to admit that not all suffering is bad. I mean, there is a reason that we suffer, and good reasons. We mentioned, for instance, suffering can be for the greater good, and eventually they have to admit that. If there was not suffering, if there were no consequences to violations of the laws of nature, for instance, then we would live in a pretty chaotic world. And so they have to admit at some point then that, well, you can't really say that all suffering is bad because it does provide some benefits. We talked about that last week. So where we got to last week is that then the argument boils down to, well, it's not just the fact that there's suffering in the world, but that there is all of this pointless suffering, or what they may call unnecessary suffering, or in some of their writings they call it unabsorbed suffering. That is, there appears to be suffering for no apparent reason, no advantage. It's not for the greater good. It doesn't end up bringing a good result, and therefore the God of the Bible cannot exist because there's too much of this unnecessary evil, harm, suffering, whatever you want to call it. Well, of course, the problem with that is that first of all, who defines what is pointless, unnecessary, and unabsorbed? That is from whose vantage point, of course. Whose vantage point is that from? It's from the atheist's vantage point. In other words, if he sees suffering and he can't explain it or come up with a good reason for it, then it must be pointless. It must be unnecessary. So, and frankly, when it gets down to it, when you make those kind of arguments, you're actually setting yourself up as who? As the authority or as God. I mean, because you're saying, well, I know that this suffering has no point to it. Right? But the bottom line is what they're saying is, well, I don't see a point to it, therefore it's pointless. Which, of course, is a fallacious argument. If I can't see any good to it, then there must not be any. So who determines? Then who determines if there truly exists some unnecessary suffering? It's interesting, and you've probably heard the name Dan Barker. He was one of the, I think he was the one that debated Kyle Butt not too many years ago. In his book, Godless, he writes that morality is simply acting with the intention to minimize harm. And in explaining what he means by minimizing harm, he says, the way to avoid, now listen, the way to avoid making a mistake, this is good advice, is to try to be as informed as possible about the likely consequences of the actions being considered. Okay, I'll buy that. If you want to know, if you want to avoid making a mistake when it comes to minimizing harm, then you should try to figure out and be as informed as you can about the consequences down the road, right? What if I perform this action? What consequences will I set in motion? And if I know that, then I can minimize harm, right? Well, who's in the best position to do that? Who's in the best position to know what consequence is going to flow from every human action? Every thought, every act, everything that any of the billions of human beings have ever done on this earth, are all leading to some particular consequence. Who is the only one in the position to know what those consequences are? Obviously, an omniscient creator is the only one that knows ultimately what the consequence of every person's actions in any particular situation are going to be. So, an atheist like Barker, he may object to God's tolerance for suffering, but let's suppose God condescended to Mr. Barker and spoke directly to him and said, well, you don't like this particular suffering that you see as pointless, but what you don't know is what? Blank, blank, blank. And God could fill in the blank with all kinds of reasons why you don't see anything good from it. And somebody says, well, wait a minute, hasn't God done that before? Hasn't God done that before? Let's turn over to the book of Job. Who was suffering in the book of Job? Job was suffering, and Job didn't know why. He said, I haven't sinned. His friends told him he had. He said, I haven't done anything wrong. Why am I suffering this way? And he not only defended his own integrity, but he also He questioned God a little bit. What's going on here? And so God eventually, in this book, appears to Job, answers him out of the whirlwind, it says in chapter 38, verse 1, and he asks some questions. Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Right? God says, you know all the answers. You got them all. You questioning me about what I'm doing. But where were you in the beginning when I made all of this? Do you not think I know what's going on? Do you not think I'm in charge? Right? Look down about verse 18. Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Verse 21, do you know it because you were born then? How long have you been around, Job? Compared to me. Or because the number of your days is great? Right? He asked him a series of questions. What do you know? Exactly. Just when it gets down to it, you as a human being, how much do you really know? When it comes to these kinds of questions. To know what's going on and what's good and what's not in the grand scheme of things. Look at chapter 40, verse 2. Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? He who rebukes God, let him answer it. Now look at verse 8. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? God is pointing out to Job that human knowledge is so limited, especially as it pertains to this particular question, as to why I'm having to suffer this particular whatever situation I'm going through. And so a guy like Barker, he writes in his book, and he asks a rhetorical question, and he's meant for you to answer it in the positive. Well, wouldn't it be better? Doesn't it make more sense for us as humans to decide what's pointless? Because after all, we're the ones here. We're humans. We're the ones dealing with it. Why wouldn't it make more sense for us to decide what's pointless? What? But again, God's answered that question. Your mind, you don't know all the consequences of these things. You don't know where this leads. I do. I'm in the best position to know the big picture and how much suffering is permissible to bring about the ultimate good for humans and humankind and for any particular individual human. So only if you're infinite and omniscient can you answer those questions. And so that's what Job had to learn. So that gets us down to what is the purpose of suffering? What is its purpose? And of course, nobody has done a greater work in this regard than Brother Warren did in his particular works. He did his doctoral thesis on suffering. And so he wrote a book, How Have Atheists Proved There Is No God, in which he undercuts their argument. And he says this, God has a morally justifiable reason for having created the world in which evil can and does occur. What is that reason? It is the ideal environment for what? Soul making. Soul making. Right. He created us specifically to be immortal, free moral agents who are responsible for our own actions. And we're going to talk about this idea of free will. This earthly life is our one and only probationary period in which we determine our eternal fate. And so therefore this world is as good as any possible world could be, as Brother Warren put it, as a veil of soul making, he called it, to function in that capacity. The physical environment in which we live was created specifically and necessary for achieving this purpose. And it would have to be framed or created in such a way to allow free moral agents to make good and bad choices and decisions, and allow us to be challenged and allow us to learn the things that we need to learn from these lessons. It's just that simple. But here's the other thing too. And this is where the Bible is more logical in its approach than mere humans. Now, when you read the King James Version of the Bible, you'll read words like evil in regard, for instance, in the Old Testament. God will say, in that translation, well, He brought evil upon this particular, or even natural calamities will be referred to as evil. That's probably not the best word for that. Because the Bible is consistent in its position that evil, and I'm talking about the word evil, intrinsic evil is the only thing that's really bad in this world. Suffering, not necessarily. But what is evil? What is intrinsic evil? What is the only intrinsic evil as it's defined in the Bible? Sin. The only intrinsic evil defined in the Bible is the transgression of God's law, 1 John 3:4. Right? Sin is transgression of the law. When we violate the nature of God, that is evil. That's sinful. Not necessarily so suffering. That's not intrinsic evil. They are not intrinsically evil, pain and suffering. On the purely physical level, intrinsic evil doesn't exist. It has to be sin. Animal pain, natural calamities, human suffering, all constituent variables in this environment designed for our spiritual development. What does that do? The fact that we live in such an environment for our spiritual development that allows good and bad things to happen to us. What are lessons we learn from that? How does that shape us and form us? What are some critical realizations that we come to when we live in a world like we live in? Yeah. Before we even get to character building, what does it teach me? And that's what you're talking about, character building. But what does it tell me about life? Life is uncertain. It's precarious. Right? David said it, but a step between me and death. And frankly, we all know this, life is short. So if I understand that life is precarious and life is short, then hopefully, what is that going to prod me as a human being to do? Prepare for the afterlife. Right, prepare for what comes next. Remember, this is a veil of soul making. It is trying to impress upon me the necessity of getting my life in harmony with God so that I can be ready for what's really important, which is after all this is over. And that's what suffering and these things teach me. That's what living in this world teaches me. Life is short, it is precarious, and I need to get ready. Cultivate my spirit. Grow my moral character. As Brother Waycaster pointed out. Helps me grow in all kinds of ways as far as my character is concerned. Patience was mentioned. Courage. Humility. Fortitude. Right? Bible, a lot of times when we read the New Testament, we read the word patience. Our idea of patience, the way we use the English term patience, we generally mean long-suffering, don't we? Patient, I'm long-suffering, I put up with something. But generally the word in the New Testament for patience is hupomone, right? If I'm pronouncing it right. And that means what? It is an active word. It's not a patience, long-suffering is a passive word. The word in the New Testament is an active word, which means what? Perseverance. Perseverance. In other words, I have this steadfast fortitude and perseverance through whatever trials come my way. I overcome. It's an active term. That's some of the things that things of this world's teaching me. It's disciplining me, motivating me. Solomon said what? Let's hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Well, this life in this physical world in which we live was designed by God to get us to that point. Everything we deal with in life, you talk about money and possessions, fame, power, intelligence, wisdom, knowledge, sex, youth, pleasure, work, advancement, achievement. Everything that we deal with as human beings is designed to mold us and shape us to get us to that point where we see what is the central focus of life, and let me make sure I put that first. And that includes suffering. And if we don't have a Bible-based understanding of what life's all about, then like all of these atheists, no, we will never understand suffering. No, we won't understand it. We won't understand why there is some, because we're not looking at it with the right perspective. Job had a difficult time. Then God told him, said, look, you got to look at it from the right perspective. Any questions or comments? I've never really thought about that. The only way is that the little voice talking to you in your head? No, I guess the only way I can think about God talking is Charlton Heston. And by the way, he was the voice of God. You know that? He was not just Moses, he was the voice of God. Well, that leads us into the next subject. And this is something you always hear about. We're talking about positive evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible. Another positive evidence, which of course is linked to suffering, is the fact that we are free moral agents. That is, we have the ability to choose, make decisions, free will. Someone says, well, how's that a positive evidence for the existence of God? Well, let's think about it. If there's no such thing as God, there's no such thing as anything that's spiritual, everything that exists, as the atheist teaches, Carl Sagan and Richard Dawkins and all these others. If all there is the material, then you have no what? Yeah, there's no you. You have no you. There's no separate you. There's no soul. There's no spirit. You're not really self-aware, even though I know I am. I'm not a rock. I'm not even a dog. I know that I'm separate from my environment around me and that I make decisions that affect other people. But if you're a materialist, that can't be. So what is it that motivates you to do what you do? What got you here today? Why did you get up this morning? Brother Cates used to call it a sense of oughtness. I ought to do what's right. I ought to get up and do this. I ought to do that. What motivated you, if all there is the material universe in which you live, what got you here today? From their perspective. I'm not asking you about what you really know to be true, but from a materialistic perspective, from an atheist perspective, from an evolutionist perspective, if all there is the material, what made you get up and come here today?
From your eyes.
Yes.
I don't know.
Huh? No, it's not because you should. Chemical reactions. That's it. Your atoms and molecules, whatever chemical reactions happened in your body, caused you to get up and come here today. That's what they have to believe. Because you understand, there's nothing spiritual, there's nothing ethereal, there's nothing beyond what... And the only thing that's physical is atoms and molecules. Chemical reactions. That's it.
So do they think that when you die, you're just like a robot whose battery has gone out? Because if you watch someone, the minute the soul leaves the body, I mean, there's an obvious shutdown. How do they explain?
Yes, you are as one called it in one of his books, you are a meat robot. That's what you are. You're a meat robot. Famous evolutionist Sam Harris. And look, here's the bottom line. The atheists that write on this subject know this is the position position they have to take. Now, there are a lot of atheists and evolutionists that will not, they don't know what to do about this subject. Because they know when they get up every day, they do what? They make decisions. They make choices. And they know they make choices. And so they're really not sure how to deal with this. And some of them won't admit it. But others know, look, this is the only way, this is the only thing that's consistent with our philosophy. There is no you. You're a collection of atoms and molecules, chemical reactions. Sam Harris, in defending this idea of no free will, in his book, wrote, "Am I free to change my mind? Of course not. It can only change me." Well, let's examine that stupid statement. Am I free to change my mind? Well, here's the irony in that. What do all these evolutionists do? They write books, right? And they give lectures. And what's the point of their lectures and their books? To change your mind. To get you to accept their position. That is stupid if you can't change your position, because the reason you believe in God is your genes. You were born that way. It is a chemical process in your body that makes you a Bible believer, while a different chemical process and a different gene in the atheist makes him a non-believer. And therefore, your mind cannot be changed because you're just doing whatever your physical makeup tells you to do. This is stupid for them to write these books. And let's think about this.
Well, it's stupid to write the books because we're not really supposed to read them anyway. We're just animals. And animals can't read. So.
Well, we're evolved animals, though, so we can read. But look at the second part of his statement. Am I free to change my mind? Of course not. It can only change me. Well, wait a minute. Who's the me? Who's the me in the statement? The fact that I can differentiate between my mind, changing my mind, and it can only change me, well, there's a separate me there. You can't talk about me or I if you're just a bunch of collection of atoms and molecules. You have no self-awareness, no consciousness, no ability to make decisions on your own. You're just doing whatever your body tells you to do. It's kind of funny, but let's think about this for a minute. In his acknowledgement of his book, he actually has an acknowledgement section. Now, get this. He says, "I would like to thank my wife and editor, Annika Harris, for her contributions to free will." That was the name of the book, Free Will. "As is always the case, her insights and recommendations greatly improve the book. I don't know how she manages to raise our daughter, work on her own projects, and still have time to edit my books. But she does. I'm extremely lucky and grateful to have her in my corner." Well, that's great. I'm glad you acknowledged your wife's contributions to the book. But we normally thank people for doing something for us. Why? Why do we thank people for doing things for us? Well, exactly. They didn't have to help us. They could have chosen to do something else. But wait a minute. He's thanking his wife, and she had no choice. She's not making any decisions. You understand? She's a group of atoms and molecules. She's just chemical reactions. So she has no volition, no separate me, no separate will. Whatever she did to help him with the book, her genes told her she had to do that. You understand their position if they're consistent? It would have been just as easy for him to say, "I would really like to thank the computer I typed this book on because it did such a fine job." It's the same thing. But why did he thank his wife and not his computer? Not just because he wanted to, butter her up or something. But why, seriously, why did he thank his wife and not his computer or his lungs? Because, the oxygen he was breathing and doing all that. Why did he thank her over the other stuff? Because he understands that she did it out of love and she had a free will choice to help him. Otherwise, it'd be stupid to thank her. To do something that she had no choice but to do. Go back, and I think we've talked about this before. There was an atheist named William Provine who spoke at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He was giving a keynote address on the second annual Darwin Day.
And he made these points. These are good points to always go back to. Clear consequences that Darwin understood from naturalistic evolution is, number one, no gods worth having exist. No life after death. You know, atheists are always positive, cheery people too. No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. And this is all consistent, by the way. 4, no ultimate meaning in life exists. And 5, human free will is non-existent. Now that's the point that many atheists overlook. That if this is really a material world in which we live, you don't really have free will. This guy also showed up in Ben Stein's documentary Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed in 2008. And let me read you, again, let me they're such you really want to be around these kind of things. He said, discussing evolution, it starts by giving up an active deity. Then it gives up the hope that there's any life after death. And when you give those two up, the rest of it follows fairly easily. You give up the hope that there is immanent morality, and finally there's no human free will, and if you believe in evolution, you can't hope for there being any free will. So that's his thing. No hope, no hope, no hope. Late Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick said in his book, you, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You know, you go home and let's say you get in your attic and you open a box of mementos and all those memories flood back to a good time in your life. Maybe you're looking through your wedding photos and all that. That's just chemical reaction. That's just molecules. If you're an evolutionist. And of course, you remember Richard Dawkins. He wrote the book The Selfish Gene, talking about us being survival machines. It's just our selfish molecules and genes looking to, make sure that they survive, and that basically everything we do is just to take advantage of other people so that we can, our genes can survive, exploit other people so we can pass on our genetic information. And again, it's nothing, you have no free will to make any decisions. The problem, of course, is that many atheists know that they get up every day and they make choices and they make decisions, and they have a hard time going to all the way to the logical conclusion of their belief, which is what it would be if they were honest with themselves. But the bottom line is, if we make decisions, if we actually make choices, and you know you do, then that means you have a separate me inside you. You have a soul, a spirit. There's something supernatural there. And if you have it, then there's only one explanation for that, which is what? God. There has to be something anterior to and superior to the universe in which we live. Now, so how do they explain it? Look, people say, well, look, I make decisions every day. I make choices every day. I do things all the time. So how does the atheist respond? What's his argument going to be? This is just as dumb as the first part. Dan Barker would say that, no, you don't really have free will. Free will is just a what? It's an illusion. You think you do. Yeah, that's a good point. You think you do, but you don't really. And again, as you just pointed out, one of the damaging lines of reasoning against this illusion idea is how far these guys like Dan Barker go to convince other people of this position. Your free will is an illusion, you don't really have it, but I'm going to write books and books and books, and I'm going to lecture and lecture and lecture and try to convince you to believe the way I do. That again is stupid. Well, it demands that if they're going to try to change my mind, first of all, you have to accept this, that Dan Barker, or or some other atheist who's trying to change my mind has the free will to do that, to decide that's what he wants to do. And number two, then the party that's evaluating his position has to have the free will to change his mind. There's two things that have to happen here. And yet we're survival machines that can't make any real choices. We're just programmed the way we are. And I like what one writer said, an atheist actually has to assume free will in order to even talk about the subject. Evolutionary biologist Jerry Cohen's the guy that came up with this phrase, meat robots. Let me read you what he said. This is kind of funny. I'm thinking this was in a, I don't think this was in a book. I think this was in some kind of lecture he was giving. Yeah. He said, even our very desire to try to change people's minds, he's talking about, it's determined by the laws of physics. The fact that I'm up here at this lecture trying to do this is determined by my own, physical constitution and environment. That is the infinite regress and the sort of annoying thing about determinism. These turtles all the way down. Well, now let's think about that for a minute. He said that's annoying. Well, who's annoying? And why is he annoying? Right? I mean, now think about it. He's just a big set of molecules and atoms. And he can't help but get up there and try to persuade these people to his position. But this whole idea of determinism, he says, is kind of annoying. Well, what is annoyance anyway? If I'm annoyed, that is what? It's an emotion, right? And so I have to ask the question, why would atoms and molecules and physical and chemical processes be annoyed? Who's annoyed here? Is it, if his chemistry is just forcing him to get up there and make these speeches, why is he annoyed about it? Well, obviously who's annoyed is the real Mr. Cohen. The him, the me, the person inside is the one that's annoyed. So again, another silly statement.
Greg, if you think about along the same line, if you think about the foolishness of why. The atheist says, I need to convert this man to believe as I believe. The only question is, why?
Yeah.
What's accomplished in order to better the human race?
Yeah. Well, generally they'll come back with, well, religion's a cause of all our problems. We just have a utopia. The problem, of course, of an atheistic utopia is, what is the necessary implication? If you take this position, there's no free will. What is the implication with regard to morality, crime, punishment, justice? What's the obvious implication of that?
If we follow it to the logical conclusion, we need no laws, we need no police, we need no courts. Everybody just does what comes natural and there's no consequences.
Right. There's no consequences because you haven't done anything wrong. I mean, the rapist says, look, my genes made me do it. The murderer says it was my chemistry. The adulterer says it was my environment. Look, the school shooter and the terrorist that blew up whatever building and killed hundreds of people, they couldn't help do what they did. I mean, they had to. That's what their chemistry told them. I mean, that's just what it had them do. They didn't make that choice.
Because they think that they have no value. I mean, that's the bottom line. No one has any value.
Let's get to the bottom line. When I make a decision, it's a bad decision. What do I feel? What do I feel when I make a bad decision? I feel guilt. Why would atoms, molecules, and chemistry feel guilt? Chemical processes. If I make a good decision, I feel what? I feel good. I feel triumphant of having chosen the right decision. It's not just an illusion. When I make decisions, there are consequences to me, the person inside me. And the only way that you can make sense of that is that there is a God in heaven who has endowed us with with mind, with consciousness, and with a soul, that's the only way you can explain the fact that we all make decisions. And we're free to choose. And again, that gets to the point. Why do people want to believe that way? Why do they want to believe that way? I think we've just said it. Here's what Cohen said. The benefit of denying free will is that you have a lack of regret for bad things that happen. It takes away a certain amount of guilt feelings from you. You don't have to beat yourself up over, I should have done this instead of that. Well, okay, welcome to the club. We've been doing that since the Garden of Eden, right? Adam sinned, and what was the first thing who's the first person he blamed? He blamed Eve, and then ultimately he blamed who? God. He said, you gave me the woman. She got me in this mess. We've been doing that ever since. So we blame God, we blame our parents, we blame our genes, we blame society, we blame our spouse, we blame our circumstances, we blame everything under the sun when we sin. Yeah.
I think this is not just academic either, because we see today how it leads to hatred. They hate anybody who disagrees with them.
Yeah, because the very fact that there are Christians that they have to come in contact and see, this is the way it's always been with evil people. You don't have to say a word to them about the Bible or their behavior. Evil people hate Christians because the fact they're Christians reminds them that they are evil. And that they are on the wrong side. And I get so sick of this phrase, we're on the wrong side or the right side of history. There's only one right side of history, and that's God's side. Anything else is on the wrong side. I get sick of hearing that in the news. But we blame everything. And we see it in our criminal justice system. Clarence Darrow and Leopold, what's-his-face, and all that bunch. Or those two Menendez brothers out there killed their parents. They got off. Right?
We don't blame self, though.
No, we don't blame. That's the last person we blame.
It's easy to try and transfer responsibility. What we can't transfer is the accountability.
And the bottom line is we think, well, if I'm not responsible, then there's no punishment coming my way. Right? No punishment coming my way. Again, you go back to Romans 1 and read the whole context, 18 through 22. This is what God's talking about. But God says in 2 Corinthians 5:10, we must all appear before the judgment seat. Right? Give an answer to the things that we've done in the body, according to what we've done, whether they're good or bad. The fact that you have free moral agency and you can choose what you want to do proves that there's a God in heaven. We'll pick up something else.